My 11th grade student asked, "How do I tell my husband I don't want to get married?" Before I had a chance to respond, she started explaining how her parents had arranged her marriage to a 34-year-old man from their hometown in Pakistan. The wedding was set for December 28th during winter break. She'd be flown out December 20th and wouldn't be coming back to finish school. Today was December 16th, just 4 days before they'd take her away forever. I asked if she'd told her parents how she felt. She laughed bitterly and said they knew but didn't care. This marriage would bring status to their family and connections they wanted back home. Her feelings meant nothing compared to family honor. She pulled out her phone and showed me texts from the man. Google translated messages about how beautiful she was in the photos her parents sent, how he couldn't wait to start their life together, how many children he wanted. Each message made her hands shake more. I felt sick reading them but tried to stay calm for her. I asked if she had any relatives who might help, an aunt or uncle who could intervene. She shook her head. Everyone was either back in Pakistan or fully supported the marriage. Even her older sister, who'd been married at 17, told her to stop being dramatic and accept her duty. I told her I'd tell Principal Franz, but he already knew and had chosen to do nothing. He was worried about cultural sensitivity or legal complications. Easier to let a bright girl disappear than risk controversy. The system had failed her completely. She asked and begged me what she should do. I gave her the number for a women's shelter that specialized in forced marriage cases, told her they had lawyers and safe houses, that she had rights even if her parents said otherwise. She typed the number into her phone with shaking fingers. Her friends memorized it too in case her phone got taken. The next day, Aliyah didn't come to school. Or the day after. Her friends said her parents had found the shelter's number in her phone and accused her of bringing shame to the family. They'd moved the flight up to the next day, December 18th. One of them had seen a car full of relatives arrive at Aliyah's house to make sure she didn't run. I called Child Protective Services, filed reports, demanded meetings, but I only had 24 hours at that point. By the time I got an email back saying they'd look into it, December 18th had come and gone. She was already on a plane to Pakistan. I spent that night researching everything I could about forced marriages in Pakistan. The laws, the shelters, the organizations that helped girls escape. I couldn't stop thinking about her trapped on that plane, knowing what waited for her. A stranger's bed, a life of servitude, her dreams of college crushed. The next morning, I did something insane. I bought a plane ticket to Karachi, maxed out my credit card for a flight leaving that afternoon. I didn't speak Urdu, didn't know the city, had no plan beyond finding her before December 28th. But I couldn't just sit at home grading papers while she was forced into marriage. My wife thought I'd lost my mind. The principal threatened to fire me for abandoning my classes. But I kept seeing Aliyah's face when she'd asked for help. Kept hearing her voice crack when she'd said nobody cared. Someone had to care. Someone had to try. The flight was 22 hours with layovers. I used the time to research her hometown. Found the mosque where weddings happened. Located women's rights lawyers in the area, though most seemed too scared to take forced marriage cases. Downloaded translation apps and maps. Prepared for something I had no business attempting. I landed in Karachi on December 22nd. The heat hit like a wall even in winter. The airport was chaos with languages I didn't understand and signs I couldn't read. I took a taxi to a cheap hotel and started making calls. The women's shelter I'd given Aliyah. Local activists. Anyone who might help. Most hung up when they heard my American accent. Others listened politely, then explained I didn't understand their culture. One lawyer said even if I found her, her parents would never let me near her. I was a foreign man. It would be seen as an attack on their honor. I could end up arrested, or worse. December 24th. I hired a driver to take me to her hometown 2 hours outside Karachi. We drove through countryside that looked beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Mountains in the distance. Villages with no signs of modern life. Places where a 16-year-old girl could disappear forever. The town was smaller than I'd imagined. Dusty streets, market stalls, women in full coverings, and men who stared at the obvious outsider. I had the driver ask about the wedding, where the girl from America was staying. Most people turned away, but finally an old woman pointed to a walled compound on the hill. December 25th. I watched that compound from a distance. Saw cars arriving with wedding supplies. Caught a glimpse of someone who might have been Aliyah through an upstairs window. Or maybe just wishful thinking. I couldn't get closer without causing an incident that would only make things worse. December 26th. I tried the legal route one more time. Found a courthouse and tried to file something. Anything. But I had no standing. No proof of coercion. No right to interfere in family matters. The clerk looked at me with pity and suggested I go home before I got hurt. December 27th. I was desperate. 1 day left. I'd flown halfway around the world and accomplished nothing. Aliyah was still trapped in that compound. Still facing marriage to a stranger. I'd failed her just like everyone else had. That night, I hired the driver one more time. Told him to take me past the compound slowly. Maybe I could see her. Signal somehow that someone had tried. That she hadn't been forgotten. It was pathetic, but all I had left. As we drove by, I saw lights and celebration preparations. Tomorrow's wedding decorations going up. My phone buzzed with a message from my wife asking when I was coming home. Another from the principal saying my job was gone. None of it mattered compared to the girl trapped behind those walls. December 28th arrived with morning prayers echoing across the town. I sat in my hotel room defeated. In a few hours, Aliyah would be married. Her life as she'd wanted it would be over. Everything she'd worked for in school meaningless. I'd spent thousands of dollars and risked everything to save her and failed completely. I was packing to leave when my phone buzzed. An unknown international number. My hands shook as I opened the message. 4 words that made me drop the phone. Go back to your country or there will be consequences. My hands went cold reading those 4 words on the screen. I grabbed my passport and shoved clothes into my bag without folding them. The cheap hotel room had one window facing the street and I kept checking it while packing. Every car that slowed down made my heart pound harder. I zipped the bag and headed for the door but stopped when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They passed by and I waited another minute before opening the door. The hallway was empty but I still ran to the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. Outside, I waved down the first taxi I saw and jumped in before the driver could even stop completely. I told him to drive anywhere away from here and watch through the back window for anyone following us. The driver looked at me in his mirror and asked if I was okay. I said yes, but my voice cracked and he didn't believe me. He drove faster and took several turns without me asking. After 10 minutes, he said we weren't being followed and suggested a hotel near the US consulate where Americans usually stayed. I nodded and tried to stop my hands from shaking. The new hotel was bigger with security guards at the entrance and cameras everywhere. I paid cash and gave my name with different spelling when checking in. The room was on the 4th floor with a view of the consulate building, which made me feel slightly safer. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it before calling my wife. She answered on the first ring and started crying when she heard my voice. She begged me to come home right away and said no student was worth dying for in Pakistan. I told her I was safe now but needed a few more days to try one last thing. She said I was being stupid and selfish and that Aliyah was already married, so what was the point? I promised to book a flight soon and hung up before she could argue more. My laptop was still in my bag, and I opened it to search for forced marriage organizations in Pakistan. Page after page of search results came up, but most were in Urdu, which I couldn't read. I used Google Translate to understand what each organization did, and made a list of phone numbers. Some focused on legal help, while others ran secret shelters for women escaping violence. My eyes burned from staring at the screen for hours, but I kept adding names and numbers to my list. One website had testimonials from girls who escaped forced marriages, and their stories were horrible. Beatings and rape and being locked in rooms for months until they agreed to submit. But some had escaped with help from these organizations and rebuilt their lives. I wrote down every contact number and email address I could find. The next morning, I started calling the organizations on my list. The first 3 hung up when they heard my American accent without letting me explain. The 4th listened for 30 seconds, then said they couldn't help foreigners and disconnected. I kept calling and getting rejected over and over. One receptionist whispered that wealthy families were too dangerous to challenge before hanging up. Another said they only helped women who came to them directly, not through third parties. Each rejection made me feel more useless, but I kept dialing numbers. Around noon, I finally reached someone willing to listen. Her name was Anita Frost, and she was American working with a shelter network in Pakistan. I told her everything about Aliyah from the beginning without stopping. She didn't interrupt or rush me and waited until I finished before responding. She explained that without Aliyah asking for help directly, their options were very limited legally. The marriage was done and Pakistani law wouldn't interfere without the wife's complaint. But she took down all of Aliyah's information and said they'd keep her file active. If Aliyah ever managed to call or escape even years later, they'd be ready to help immediately. It wasn't much, but at least someone else knew and cared about what happened. Anita then gave me another number for Christopher Ortega, who was a journalist covering human rights issues. She said media attention sometimes helped pressure families, though it could also make things worse for victims. I wrote down his number while thinking about whether going public would help or hurt Aliyah. Christopher answered when I called and listened to my story with interest. He said we should meet in person, but not anywhere obvious since people might be watching me. He suggested a coffee shop in a wealthy part of Karachi where lots of foreigners went. He texted me specific instructions to arrive separately and sit at different tables first. We'd watch for anyone suspicious before sitting together to talk. The precautions made everything feel more dangerous and real. The coffee shop was modern with air conditioning and young people working on laptops everywhere. It looked like any Starbucks back home, which felt strange after the rural town where Aliyah was trapped. I ordered coffee and sat by the window watching people come and go. Christopher arrived 20 minutes later wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. He bought coffee and sat at the table next to mine without looking at me. We both watched the room for another 10 minutes before he nodded and moved to a corner booth. I followed and sat across from him, keeping my voice low. He'd covered dozens of forced marriage cases over 5 years and knew exactly how the system failed girls. He explained that even with media coverage, families rarely released their daughters because public shame made them dig in harder. The girls who escaped usually did it themselves after months or years of secret planning. His words crushed what little hope I had left for some dramatic rescue. But Christopher wasn't done talking yet. He pulled out his laptop and started typing notes while asking me about every single detail of how the school had handled things. I showed him my phone with all the emails I'd sent to CPS begging them to act faster. The ones where Principal Franz said he couldn't get involved in family matters. The automated responses from Child Services saying they'd investigate within 10 business days. Christopher took screenshots of everything with his own phone. He said this was exactly the kind of evidence that showed how the system failed these girls over and over. We spent another hour going through dates and timelines while he built his story angle. He explained his plan while I took notes on a napkin. I'd go back to the US and gather more documents from the school district. Get statements from other teachers who knew about Aliyah's situation. Find records of similar cases that got ignored. Meanwhile, he'd work his contacts here to track what was happening with Aliyah now that she was married. He had sources in small towns who could watch without being obvious. People who worked in government offices and could check marriage records. But we had to be careful not to use real names or give details that would point back to her family. That could make things worse for her or even get her killed for bringing shame. The story had to focus on the broken systems, not the specific people. Christopher stood up and pulled a phone from his bag. Not a regular phone, but some kind of secure device with extra encryption. He showed me how to download an app called Signal and walked me through the security settings. Two-factor authentication, disappearing messages, voice calls that couldn't be traced. He said my regular phone and email were probably already compromised. Aliyah's family had connections everywhere and they'd be watching for any interference. The threatening message I'd gotten proved they knew what I was doing. We needed to assume everything on my normal devices was monitored. I walked back to my hotel feeling paranoid, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The streets felt different now that I knew someone might be watching. Every person who looked at me too long made my chest tight. Back in my room, I opened my laptop and started booking a flight home. January 3rd gave me 6 more days to make connections and set up resources that might help Aliyah someday. The booking site showed the total would definitely push my credit card over the limit, but I clicked purchase anyway. My wife texted immediately when she saw the charge notification. Relief clear even through the message. She just wanted me home safe. I called the U.S. consulate and asked for Hope Bartlett, the name Anita had given me for someone who handled welfare cases. The receptionist transferred me and Hope answered with a tired voice. She agreed to meet me tomorrow, but warned that consular services couldn't do much for dual citizens in family situations. Still, she'd document everything officially. That night, I couldn't focus on anything except creating records of what had happened. I made a detailed timeline starting from when Aliyah first told me about the marriage. Every conversation, every email, every failed attempt to get help. I uploaded copies to Google Drive, Dropbox, and 2 other cloud services. Emailed everything to myself at 3 different addresses. Sent copies to Anita through the secure app Christopher had shown me. If something happened to me, at least the evidence would survive. The paranoia felt crazy, but also completely justified after getting threatened. Around midnight, I gave up on sleeping and started researching Pakistani marriage law on my laptop. Article after article explained that girls under 16 needed special court permission to marry. Aliyah had just turned 16 in November, which meant she was technically old enough. But wait, I found another law saying 18 was the minimum in Sindh province where we were. The laws contradicted each other and enforcement was basically non-existent anyway. I documented every legal violation I could find, knowing it was pointless without someone willing to enforce them. The gap between what the law said and what actually happened felt huge. The next morning, I took a taxi to the U.S. consulate, going through metal detectors and bag searches at the entrance. More security at the inner gate, guards checking my passport and appointment confirmation. Finally, I reached Hope's office on the 3rd floor. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes that said she'd seen too many cases like this. She took notes while I explained everything from the beginning. Aliyah's plea for help, the school's refusal to act, my failed attempts here in Pakistan, the threats I'd received. She typed it all into an official report, creating a welfare concern file that would be attached to Aliyah's passport records. Hope pulled out a pamphlet about consular services and pointed to each section while explaining the limits. If Aliyah ever came to the consulate herself, they could help. Emergency loans to get back to America, safe house connections, legal assistance. But they couldn't go get her, couldn't force her family to release her, couldn't intervene in what Pakistan considered a domestic matter. The official limitations felt crushing, even though I'd expected them. I left the consulate building feeling defeated again when my phone buzzed. WhatsApp notification from an unknown number. 2 words in English that made my hands shake. Stop now. I screenshot it immediately and forwarded it to Christopher and Hope through Signal. My chest got tight with fear but also anger. These cowards hiding behind anonymous messages, threatening me for trying to help a child. They could threaten all they wanted, but I wasn't giving up on Aliyah. I walked back to my hotel room and pulled out my laptop to start documenting everything. The blank document stared at me as I typed out how Principal Franz had known about Aliyah's situation for weeks, but chose to do nothing. I wrote about his exact words when he'd said cultural sensitivity was more important than getting involved. I detailed every phone call to CPS that went unanswered until it was too late. The shelter number I'd given her that her parents found. How the system had 24 hours to save her and did nothing. Each sentence felt like an accusation I should have screamed months ago. My phone buzzed with a message from Christopher on the encrypted app. His source in Aliyah's town had confirmed the wedding happened exactly as planned on December 28th. Over 200 guests had attended the ceremony. The source described Aliyah as looking subdued but compliant during the whole thing. No crying or resistance, just quiet acceptance of her fate. The clinical way he described her visible defeat made me run to the bathroom and throw up. I couldn't stop picturing her standing there in wedding clothes next to a stranger while everyone celebrated. That night, I set up my laptop for a video call with my wife. The moment her face appeared on screen, I lost it completely. The tears I'd been holding back for days came pouring out. I sobbed about failing Aliyah and how she was trapped forever now. My wife just listened without judging me for this insane trip. She reminded me I'd tried harder than anyone else in Aliyah's life had. Her parents, her sister, the principal, CPS, everyone had failed her, but at least I'd tried. The comfort felt empty when I thought about what that 16-year-old girl must be going through right now. December 31st came with fireworks I could hear from my hotel window. While everyone celebrated, I sat at my laptop creating resource packets about women's rights in Pakistan. I found websites about secret communication methods victims could use, escape planning guides for domestic violence situations, phone numbers for underground networks that helped women flee. I compiled everything into documents and sent them to Anita through the secure app. She messaged back that she'd translate them into Urdu and distribute them through her network. Maybe they'd be too late for Alia, but they might help someone else. January 1st, I'd arranged to meet a Pakistani women's rights lawyer at her office. She couldn't take Alia's case directly, but spent 2 hours explaining the legal process. Divorce required grounds like abuse or abandonment. Protection orders were almost impossible to get. Most forced marriage victims who escaped did so after years of planning and saving money in secret. The timeline made me sick, but at least there was a potential path someday. She gave me more phone numbers for organizations that worked underground. That evening, Christopher sent me a draft of his article through the encrypted app. He'd focused on how Western schools fail to protect immigrant girls from forced marriages, despite clear warning signs. His research showed thousands of American girls get taken abroad for forced marriages every year. The schools know but do nothing because they're afraid of being called racist. Alia's story was woven throughout but carefully anonymized. No names or identifying details that could put her in more danger. The article might actually change policies and save other girls. I was reading it when my phone buzzed with another WhatsApp message from an unknown number. This time they'd sent a photo of my hotel taken from the street. The message just said they knew where I was. My hands shook as I grabbed my stuff and checked out immediately. I found another hotel on the other side of the city and paid cash. I booked an earlier flight home for the next morning instead of January 3rd. The fear was choking me, but I was also furious at these cowards trying to intimidate me. At the third hotel, I used Christopher's secure app to message Anita about setting up long-term support for if Alia ever managed to make contact. We spent hours planning secret email accounts she might be able to access, coded messages through social media that wouldn't raise suspicion, financial resources that could be hidden and accessed remotely. We mapped out safe houses in different Pakistani cities, contact protocols that would keep her identity protected. Building this invisible safety net felt like the only useful thing left to do. My last morning in Pakistan, I woke up before dawn. I hired one more driver to take me past the compound for final documentation. From a public road at a safe distance, I took photos with my phone. The wedding decorations were being taken down by workers. Cars filled the driveway. Life had completely moved on for everyone except the girl trapped inside those walls. The photos were blurry, but they were evidence that I'd been here and tried. At Karachi Airport, the security officer pulled me aside for additional screening. They went through every item in my bags while asking why I'd visited Pakistan. I stuck to a story about being a tourist interested in historical sites. The officer clearly didn't believe me, but I kept repeating the same boring details. They made me unlock my phone and scrolled through photos. Thank God I'd deleted everything related to Alia and only had random pictures of buildings and markets. The screening took so long I missed my flight completely. The next flight wasn't until tomorrow and cost $800 I didn't have. I maxed out my second credit card buying the ticket and found a bench to sleep on in the airport. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Christopher saying one of his sources spotted someone matching Alia's description at the local market yesterday, with older women from her family. She was wearing traditional clothes and kept her head down the whole time while the women bought wedding supplies and talked to vendors about preparations for the celebration. The source said she looked defeated and didn't speak to anyone or even look at the market stalls selling books and school supplies that would have interested the old Alia. At least she was alive and moving around even if she wasn't free to do anything on her own. The flight finally boarded and I spent the next 22 hours writing page after page documenting everything about how the school failed to protect her. I listed every meeting with the principal where he dismissed my concerns about her absences and obvious distress. I wrote down dates and times of reports I filed that went nowhere because nobody wanted to deal with the cultural complications. I included screenshots of emails where administrators told me to stay out of family business and focus on teaching math. The woman next to me kept glancing at my laptop screen as I typed furiously about mandatory reporting laws and how the district violated their own policies by not investigating clear signs of abuse. By the time we started descending into JFK, I had 15 pages of documentation showing exactly how many chances they had to save Alia before her parents took her to Pakistan. I landed on January 4th feeling like I'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. My wife was waiting at baggage claim and grabbed me, so tight I could barely breathe while she cried into my shoulder. She kept touching my face like she needed to make sure I was really there and not still in some dangerous Pakistani town where anything could have happened to me. The drive home felt strange with familiar highway signs and English radio stations after days of not understanding anything around me. She told me the principal had called 3 times demanding to know when I was coming back and threatening consequences if I didn't show up for classes on Monday. I checked my email at home and found the termination letter he'd sent 2 days ago, citing job abandonment and unprofessional conduct unbecoming of an educator. I immediately forwarded it to Sterling Ellis, who ran our teachers' union and had helped other teachers fight unfair terminations. Sterling called within an hour saying this was clear retaliation for reporting child welfare concerns, and we had strong grounds to fight it through the grievance process. He said the district would have a hard time explaining why they fired a teacher for trying to save a student from forced marriage after the administration ignored multiple warnings. Sterling filed the formal grievance the next morning demanding my immediate reinstatement with back pay and a full investigation into how the principal handled Alia's case. The paperwork accused the district of retaliating against a whistleblower and failing to follow their own child protection protocols. He also demanded access to all emails and documentation about Alia's situation to prove the administration knew about the danger and chose to do nothing. 3 days later, I met with Jade Bruce from the District Compliance Office in a conference room at the Central Administration Building. I brought copies of everything, including my reports to CPS and emails showing the principal knew Alia was forced into marriage but refused to intervene. Jade's face got darker as she read through the timeline showing how many opportunities they had to help before it was too late. She opened an official investigation into policy violations and mandatory reporting failures that could result in serious consequences for everyone who ignored the warning signs. She seemed genuinely angry that a bright student had been failed by people who were supposed to protect her. Meanwhile, Christopher's article went live on several news sites describing how American schools fail to protect immigrant girls from forced marriages, despite clear warning signs. He included statistics showing hundreds of girls disappear from schools every year for arranged marriages, but administrators rarely report it or intervene. The article didn't name anyone specifically, but included enough details that people familiar with our district would recognize the situation. Teachers started sharing it on social media, and parent groups began asking questions about what protocols existed to protect their daughters. A week after getting home, I found a message in an old email account I rarely checked anymore. It came through multiple forwarded addresses and proxy servers, but simply said, "Received information, thank you," with no signature or identifying details. Anita confirmed she'd gotten something similar through their secure channels around the same time. We couldn't prove it was from Alia, but the timing and method suggested someone with limited computer access had managed to send a brief message despite being watched constantly. My wife and I started seeing Phil Cordova twice a week to work through everything that happened. She explained how terrified she'd been every night I was gone, not knowing if I was safe or if she'd ever see me again. I struggled to explain why I had to go, even though I knew it was dangerous and probably wouldn't work. Phil helped us understand that we both did what we thought was right, even though it put incredible strain on our marriage. He gave us tools to communicate better about big decisions and helped my wife understand my guilt about failing Alia while helping me see how my actions affected her. The school board announced a special public hearing about forced marriage prevention policies after Christopher's article generated dozens of calls from concerned parents and teachers. They invited me to testify about what happened and what policies might have prevented it. Other teachers started contacting me privately, sharing stories about students who disappeared suddenly and administrators who told them not to get involved in cultural issues. I walked into the board meeting room carrying a thick folder of papers and my laptop. The room was packed with teachers, parents, and reporters who'd heard about the hearing through Christopher's articles. I set up my presentation at the podium while board members shuffled through their own papers. My hands were steady now, not like that morning in Pakistan when I'd gotten the threat. I clicked through slides showing the timeline of Alia's case, every email I'd sent to Franz, every call to CPS, every missed chance to help her. Board members leaned forward in their seats as I explained how she'd come to me December 16th asking for help, and by December 18th she was on a plane to Pakistan. One board member asked why Franz hadn't reported it, and I showed his email saying it was a cultural matter. Parents in the audience started whispering to each other. 3 other teachers stood up to testify after me. Mrs. Jang talked about a Vietnamese girl who disappeared junior year after her parents found out about her American boyfriend. Mr. Rodriguez described 2 sisters from Guatemala whose family pulled them out of school for marriages back home. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Bryant, broke down crying when she told about a girl from last year who'd begged for help, but the administration said they couldn't interfere with family decisions. The pattern was clear, and the board couldn't ignore it anymore. They voted right there to create new protocols requiring teachers to report any suspected forced marriage situations directly to CPS and law enforcement, bypassing administrators if needed. They also voted to investigate Franz's handling of these cases. It felt like something, even though it was too late for Alia. 2 weeks later, Jade called me to say her investigation was done. Franz had violated 17 different policies, including mandatory reporting laws. The district put him on leave immediately, and the vice principal took over. I heard later he tried to fight it, but the evidence was too strong. Meanwhile, Christopher kept digging into Alia's situation through his contacts in Pakistan. He messaged me that her husband's family was dealing with some property dispute that was keeping them busy, which meant the marriage hadn't been fully consummated yet. Every day that passed without her getting pregnant was another day closer to possible escape. A national organization focused on forced marriage contacted me about helping them develop training materials for schools. They'd seen Christopher's articles and wanted someone with real experience to write their protocols. I spent nights after school working on modules about warning signs, intervention strategies, and support resources. Each page I wrote had Alia's ghost behind it. Anita called with an idea about setting up online education for girls like Alia. We created fake social media accounts and online courses she might be able to access from internet cafes when shopping with relatives. Basic computer skills, English lessons that could help her communicate, even coding basics that might lead to remote work someday. It was a long game, but better than nothing. Sterling finally got the union to negotiate my job situation. The district agreed to reinstate me with back pay, but I'd have to transfer to Jefferson High across town. They wouldn't admit wrongdoing, but would implement new training requirements. I took the deal because I needed the income and could do more good inside the system than outside. 2 months after I got back from Pakistan, Anita forwarded me a message through 3 different encrypted accounts. Someone using an internet cafe in Karachi had accessed our educational resources using the exact login pattern we'd taught Alia's friends to tell her about. She was studying in secret, probably during shopping trips when her mother-in-law wasn't watching. I sat in my car and cried when I read that message. Phil helped my wife and I figure out how to balance everything. We set clear rules about the advocacy work, like no more than 20 hours a week on it, no more traveling to dangerous places, and a separate savings account just for this work, so we wouldn't max out credit cards again. My wife started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter herself, finding her own way to help. She understood now why I had to try, even if it seemed crazy at the time. The framework helped us reconnect after all the stress from Pakistan. We were different people now, but stronger together. Anita called me the next week about doing some consulting work for her organization, since I had time while the union sorted out my job situation. She needed someone who understood both the education system and what warning signs teachers miss when students face forced marriages. The pay was basically nothing, but I jumped at the chance to turn my failure with Aliyah into something useful. I spent hours at their small office downtown, writing protocols based on every missed opportunity in her case, like when she stopped participating in class discussions about college, or when her parents suddenly banned after-school activities. Each checklist item came from something I should have noticed sooner. Anita reviewed my drafts and added sections about cultural sensitivity that wouldn't scare administrators away from taking action. We created flowcharts showing exactly when to call CPS versus when to contact specialized organizations like hers. The materials grew into a full training program that schools could implement without getting sued for discrimination. Christopher sent me his latest article about our district's policy changes 3 weeks later. He'd interviewed school board members who admitted they'd ignored the issue for years because they didn't want to seem culturally insensitive. The piece included statistics showing our district had lost at least 12 girls to forced marriages in the past 5 years, with 0 interventions attempted. He kept Aliyah anonymous but quoted my testimony about the principal knowing and doing nothing. The article went viral in education circles, and suddenly districts across the state wanted copies of the protocols I'd developed with Anita. That same day, I got a message through our encrypted network that made me drop my coffee mug. Someone in Karachi had accessed our hidden education portal using the exact sequence of clicks we'd taught Aliyah's friends to tell her about if they ever made contact. The user had spent 43 minutes downloading basic computer skills tutorials and English lessons before logging off. Anita traced the IP to an internet cafe near a shopping district where young wives often went for household supplies. We couldn't confirm it was her, but the timing and location matched what we knew about her situation. Over the next few days, we watched the account access more materials during what would be shopping hours in Pakistan. The district scheduled their first mandatory training on forced marriage prevention and asked me to help run it despite my employment status still being unresolved. I stood in front of 200 teachers in the same auditorium where Principal Franz used to give his start-of-year speeches about test scores. Teachers asked hard questions about how to balance respecting family values with protecting kids. We did role-playing exercises where they practiced difficult conversations with parents and students. One older teacher broke down crying and admitted she'd had 3 girls disappear over her career and never knew what to do. The training ran 4 hours and ended with every teacher getting wallet cards with emergency hotline numbers and intervention protocols. Sterling called that afternoon with news that made me punch the air in victory. The investigation into Principal Franz had uncovered 6 other cases where he'd failed to report suspected abuse or neglect, including 2 other forced marriage situations. The school board voted unanimously to terminate him immediately with no severance package. He was appealing, but Sterling said his teaching license would definitely be revoked by the state board. The man who'd chosen his reputation over Aliyah's life would never work in education again. A week later, another encrypted message came through our network from someone who'd clearly been practicing their English typing. The message said the sender was keeping notes about daily life hidden in a place nobody would look, and taking photos when possible of important documents. They were building evidence slowly and carefully for future use. The message ended with 3 words that made me tear up at my desk. "Thank you, teacher." My new school placement started in February at a different high school across town, where the principal actually cared about student welfare. She'd read Christopher's articles and specifically requested me because she wanted someone who understood these issues leading their safety initiatives. The first week there, she had me address the entire staff about recognizing abuse signs and the legal requirements for reporting. She gave me release time to continue developing training materials with Anita, and even encouraged me to testify at state hearings about prevention legislation. My colleagues saw me as an expert instead of a troublemaker, asking for advice when they noticed concerning changes in students. The support felt strange after months of fighting my previous administration. Phil helped my wife and I work through everything during our weekly counseling sessions over the next few months. She'd started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter after seeing how the Pakistan trip changed me, finding her own way to help vulnerable women. We talked about the trauma of those weeks when I was gone, and she didn't know if I'd come back safely. We set up better communication systems for my advocacy work and created an emergency fund specifically for this kind of help, so we'd never max out credit cards again. By May, we felt stronger as a couple than before everything happened, united by shared purpose instead of divided by my obsession. The state legislature held hearings on forced marriage prevention that month and asked me to testify via video link about our district's failures and the changes that followed. I shared Aliyah's story without naming her, explaining how a straight A student with college dreams disappeared because adults prioritized cultural comfort over child safety. The committee members asked detailed questions about warning signs and intervention points. 2 weeks later, they passed the legislation with requirements for teacher training and emergency intervention protocols. Anita called me the day after the legislation passed with incredible news about funding. Her organization had received a $2 million federal grant to expand their forced marriage prevention work nationwide, partially based on the protocols we'd developed together. She offered me a full-time position as their National School Partnership Coordinator, traveling to districts across the country to implement training programs. The salary was decent, and the work would let me help thousands of potential aliyahs. I accepted immediately, finally having found my real purpose in education beyond teaching algebra. My first day at the new job, Anita handed me a thick folder of cases from across the country and told me we had 6 weeks to develop training materials that could save lives. The encrypted messaging app buzzed that same morning with news from our network in Pakistan that made me drop my coffee mug on the office floor. Aliyah had managed to photograph her passport and birth certificate during a family gathering when everyone was distracted by wedding preparations for a cousin. She'd been stealing small amounts of money from household shopping for months, hiding it in a sealed plastic bag buried in the garden behind the house. The message also said she'd identified an aunt who'd helped another girl escape years ago, though contacting her was still too risky. Her husband traveled for business frequently, giving her windows of relative freedom she was using to build her escape plan piece by piece. I showed Anita the message and she immediately updated Aliyah's file with the new information, marking her as actively planning rather than passive victim. My wife called during lunch to say the district had scheduled the first teacher training session using our new protocols for next week. 300 teachers would attend the mandatory session where I'd explain the warning signs and intervention procedures we'd developed. The principal from my new school volunteered to help present, saying he'd seen too many kids disappear without anyone asking questions. That first training session went better than expected, with teachers asking detailed questions and sharing their own concerns about students they suspected were at risk. Within days of that training, 3 separate cases were flagged by teachers who recognized the warning signs we'd outlined. One girl's parents had started talking about a summer trip to India she wouldn't return from. Another had suddenly stopped participating in after-school activities and mentioned an older man her family wanted her to meet. The third case involved a boy whose family was planning to send him to Yemen for an arranged marriage to his cousin. The district's new rapid response team intervened in all 3 cases within 48 hours of the reports. Social workers visited the families with interpreters and cultural liaisons, offering resources and support, while making clear that removing children from the school for forced marriage would result in criminal charges. 2 families accepted counseling and delayed their plans. The third family tried to leave the state, but was stopped at the airport when the girl's name appeared on a watch list we'd helped create. Christopher called me that spring with news that his forced marriage series had won a National Journalism Award. He was donating the $20,000 prize to organizations helping victims, splitting it between Anita's group and shelters in Pakistan. His articles had been read by over 3 million people and sparked investigations in 12 states. Politicians were calling for federal legislation based on the protocols we'd developed. Principal Franz's appeal hearing happened that same month, with the review board examining evidence from multiple cases he'd ignored. Parents testified about their daughters who'd vanished after Franz dismissed concerns. Teachers described being told not to make waves about cultural issues. The board voted unanimously to revoke his teaching license permanently. He'd never work in education again. The state legislature passed our protocols into law in July, requiring every district to implement forced marriage prevention programs within 6 months. Schools that failed to report suspected cases would face criminal liability. The law included funding for cultural liaisons and emergency intervention teams. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. That fall, almost exactly a year after my trip to Pakistan, another encrypted message arrived. Aliyah had enrolled in online university courses using a fake name and internet cafes during shopping trips. She'd be 18 in 15 months and could legally divorce under Pakistani law once she reached that age. Our network confirmed lawyers were already preparing her case in secret. My wife suggested we become foster parents during one of our counseling sessions with Phil. She'd been volunteering at the domestic violence shelter and kept meeting teenage girls with nowhere safe to go. We completed the training and home study over several months, getting certified specifically for older teens from immigrant families. Our first placement came in November, a 16-year-old Pakistani girl named Fatima, whose situation felt painfully familiar. Her parents had been planning to send her to Lahore for marriage to a 40-year-old businessman. A teacher trained in our protocols had noticed the warning signs and reported it immediately. CPS removed her within 24 hours. Fatima moved into our spare bedroom with just a backpack of clothes. She spent the first week barely speaking, terrified her family would find her, or that we'd send her back. My wife worked from home those days to make sure she felt safe. Slowly, she started to trust us, especially when she saw the resources we'd gathered for girls in her situation. We enrolled her in a new school under court protection, where she could finish her education without fear. The State Board of Education adopted our protocols as the standard for all districts that winter. They created a dedicated office for forced marriage prevention with a hotline students could call directly. Franz's case was cited repeatedly as an example of institutional failure that couldn't happen again. 2 years after that December day when Aliyah first asked for help, I was preparing materials for a national conference when my phone buzzed with a message that made me sit down hard on my office floor. The network confirmed Aliyah had successfully escaped to a women's shelter in Islamabad, using every resource and connection we'd provided over 2 years. She'd filed for divorce, enrolled in law school, and wanted me to know she was free. Her message said she was going to become a lawyer to help girls like her, that she'd never forgotten that someone had cared enough to try to that the invisible ladder we'd built had saved her life. Hey, thanks for letting me wander through all this with you today. That was a fun ride. I really appreciate you sticking around. I'll see you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.